Hello, I'm Jane Vowles.
I'm Pami Natterson.
I am Sheila Ojeda.
I'm Kirsten Patterson.
I am Kamala Rampersad de Silva.
This is Kali Chui. As CEO of this institute, I am pleased to be collaborating with other female leaders
who are working incredibly hard to improve governance practices in their regions.
It is noteworthy that even as the challenges of COVID-19 are impacting our governance practices,
in many boardrooms, women's voices are absent,
silent,
or go unheard.
Yet, it is clear that the economic impact of COVID-19 is devastating.
Not only in terms of the estimated $90 trillion lost globally,
but as we see happening in some countries,
emotions are running high with respect to dealing with very fundamental decisions
like economic recovery,
reopening borders,
vaccinations,
and freedom of choice.
We cannot afford to lose out on the contribution women can make
to solve some of these problems.
We welcome you
as you join us in this 3-part series
on women in governance to bring positive change.
Positive change.
Positive change.
A change where we embrace all our voices
so that we can all contribute effectively to making governance worldwide more effective,
inclusive,
and diverse.
In other words, let's stop competing
and begin collaborating.
Let's help solve many of these problems.
To everybody online here today, across countries, languages and affiliations, kia ora, talofa lava and warm Pacific greetings from our beautiful Aotearoa, New Zealand. I wish to take a moment, however, to acknowledge that we are having this conversation today in the context of deep global sadness while we are working through the many waves of the global pandemic. I'd like to extend my condolences to anybody who has had a personal loss at this time. I also want to thank the Institute of Directors New Zealand for this opportunity to address you all and to share some thoughts about women on boards and the unique attributes that women bring to governance that help organisations be successful. So let's start with why having more women on boards matter. When we begin to discuss the benefits of increasing female representation on boards, not only is it hard to know where to start, it's equally difficult to know where to stop. Countless studies from around the world have proven the benefits of gender diversity in governance. So it remains a sad state of affairs that we need to prove the value time and again to the world at large. In 1893, yes, I'm going that far back, New Zealand was the first country in the world where women gained the right to vote. Our country at that time acknowledged and understood the importance of giving women the right to have a voice in how our nation is ruled. Although we have never looked back, our progress towards fair representation of women in executive leadership positions and governance roles, like many other countries, is still lagging. Last year, Catalyst produced research where they found that mixed gender boards are generally associated with a number of positive outcomes, including effective risk management. They found that having more women on boards brings increased monitoring and strategy involvement and increases the board's access to resources and expertise. And of course, with better access to information, it follows that risk management practices are, as a consequence, enhanced. The Catalyst report also finds that gender diverse boards go hand in hand with fewer financial mistakes and controversial business practices, such as fraud or earnings manipulation, and reduces the overconfidence of our colleagues and our male CEOs. an issue which has been shown to result in some poor financial outcomes. Finally, they also highlight that the presence of women encourages multiple perspectives that are better aligned with the market, noting diverse boards are better able to recognise the needs and interests of different stakeholder groups. In particular, boardroom diversity strengthens environmental, social, and overall governance performance, and they are better able to serve the people they represent. All in all, when organisations are able to start thinking outside of the traditional homogeneous framework of governance, business performance improves. There are indeed numerous studies that link gender diverse boards with improved indicators of profitability and financial health. And who does not know of the McKinsey and the Harvard statistics that tell this story? But I believe boards also have a vital role to play in advancing social justice and equality, which again, in the end, is good for business. And a great example here, in fact, is the global response to the pandemic. Here in New Zealand, we have heard from our leaders over and over again that the best economic response is a health response. Our government, led by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, has taken the lives and the livelihood of our people seriously from day one. And while we are by far not out of the woods yet, our country is at this time really blessed with our ability to bounce back economically. So social justice, equality, equity, empathy, these are areas where women excel in bringing different perspectives to the boardroom table, leading governance strategies that better recognise the needs and interests of different stakeholder groups. With women disproportionately affected by the pandemic, having diverse talent at the board table who exercise more progressive and holistic thinking is more important now than ever. So what is the current state of play with women on boards? Well, executive search company Egon Zehnder has tracked gender and international diversity on boards around the globe biannually for the past 16 years. With the latest report released in 2020, covering about 1,600 companies across 44 countries. And as its authors note, despite the attention on this issue, there simply has not been enough progress made. They found that globally, overall, approximately only 23% of board positions were held by women. This is still far from gender parity. Indeed, only 2 countries, France and New Zealand, had more than 40% of their large company board seats filled by women. Other leaders were the Nordic countries, Norway and Finland. But at the other end are countries such as Saudi Arabia on 3%, South Korea on 6%, and Chile on 7%. This global survey also looks at the number of companies that have at least one woman on the board. Globally, this number rose from 85% in 2018 to 89% in 2020. And while it's satisfying to see this progress, this means that there's 1 in 10 large global companies who do not even have one female director on their board. And if this is not depressing enough, the data is even more concerning when we look at the number of women leading our boards. Globally, women fill just 7% of the non-executive chair roles on boards. This is concerning, considering that we know to ensure that boards are inclusive, board chairs must be from a range of backgrounds and experiences. Clearly, we've got a long way to go yet. Again, these figures vary from country to country. New Zealand may be a leader when it comes to putting women on boards, but we are falling behind when it comes to putting them in charge of our boards. The Chartered Governance Institute International Governance Stocktake found that 17% of board chair roles were filled by women in New Zealand, compared with countries like Norway and Italy with around 40%. And of interest here is that both of these countries operate quota systems. In fact, in 2020, there was only one female board chair in the top 10 listed companies in New Zealand. It's not our best statistic. That said, our public sector in New Zealand is more worthy of the spotlight than many of our listed companies. The New Zealand government announced last month that it had met its target of 50% on public sector boards and committees. Further, the 2020 New Zealand government stocktake of gender and ethnic diversity on public sector boards said achieving this target has been as a result of the recognition of the importance of women's leadership and gender diversity in governance. It is interesting to note that women make up 53.2% of the top 3 tiers of leadership in our public sector. The correlation between women in senior leadership in government and the corresponding number of women in public sector governance roles can't be dismissed. The New Zealand government is effectively and proactively driving a rich succession talent pool for public sector boards and committees, and we can learn from this. And the stocktake also identified that Wahine Maori, or our Indigenous Maori women, currently hold 12% of public sector roles, but there are considerable gaps in representation from our other ethnic communities. They comment that when we consider this against the backdrop that ethnic communities constitute 20% of New Zealand's population, in fact, we are a melting pot of approximately 215 different ethnicities. It is clear we need to do more to increase their representation in the government sector. However, they're taking action. Acknowledging this, the New Zealand government has funded and provided access to governance training and networking events for members on their nominations database. Work is also being done to develop an accessible digital platform that will provide governance training and support to people who are new to governance. This initiative aims to increase pathways for people from diverse communities into public sector governance roles. So let's take a minute and talk about some of those barriers to female advancement. It is clear that traditional policies, practices, and perceptions continue to undermine the advancement of women. Although progress is being made, it is not at a pace needed to create real change. What's too often missing is a sense of urgency. People frankly believe we are going to get there eventually, but this is not enough. It's far too slow. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report for 2021, another generation of women will have to wait for gender parity. As the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be felt, closing the global gender gap has increased by a further generation, from 99.5 years to 135.6 years. They further note that progress towards gender parity is stalling in several large economies and industries, and COVID has a big part to play in this. This is partly due to women being more frequently employed in sectors hardest hit by lockdowns, combined with the additional pressures of providing care at home. The knock-on effects of this will be felt for decades to come. And as this is the future pipeline of talent for the boards of tomorrow, we should all be very concerned. Look, as a group here today, no doubt we have faced our fair share of barriers placed in the way of our advancement. Unconscious bias has a large part to play in this. Whether it's the pushback that we don't have the right competencies or experiences, code for your background isn't like mine, or there just aren't enough skilled women candidates because they recruit from traditional talent pools, And of course, my personal favourite, surely this is all just political correctness gone mad, which is code for we're okay and we don't really see why we need to change. So how are we going to create that change? Although we have the proven business case, we are lacking the structural measures and roadmaps in place to make this an easier transition for women into governance. This starts with creating an inclusive, merit-based culture that fundamentally supports and embeds diversity and inclusion at both the board and the organisation levels. The more females we have in leadership positions, the more we have visible, positive role models for other women entering the workforce, giving them a goal to aspire to. It creates a circular loop, and the knock-on effect can be impactful. Clearly, a diverse mix of people at board level sends a clear message both to the market and to employees that the company is focused on performance and open to embracing change and difference. So what are some of those practical things an organisation can do? Well, firstly, it starts with an organisation making a visible commitment from the top to diversity and inclusion, backed by clearly articulated goals and measures, which are all underpinned by sustained and deliberate actions. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and ultimately the board sets the tone for the culture of the organisation. I think we need to find a different, more sustainable model, whether it's within recruitment, tackling unconscious bias, or how we consider leadership characteristics, or making space for different styles and background experiences. I believe cultivating a culture of inclusion and creating a pipeline of female candidates are arguably the single most important elements of a successful board inclusion effort. The most obvious action is that organisations need to set some targets to achieve change and start looking for diverse candidates in different places. And of course, by ensuring women are included on every candidate shortlist. I do not buy into the rhetoric that it's hard to find competent women for governance roles. Finding the best talent today, wherever it is, requires deliberate action to explore alternative recruitment channels and markets, and to challenge the criteria we set for selection to ensure it is both inclusive and embracing of different competencies and experiences. We know that women often don't come up through an organisation in traditional male pathways. I am one of those women. Therefore, we need organisations to open their minds and selection criteria to look beyond traditional networks and the stereotypical board candidate profile. Certainly, seeking talent from the same talent pools has not been effective in yielding results to date. Organisations and boards that do this well maintain a database of talent and cultivate a network to identify potential board members. So when the time is right for appointment, they have a strong, diverse network to tap into. So it's simply an excuse to say competent women do not exist for board roles. In New Zealand, as an example, women make up nearly half of the workforce and are well represented in fields that are highly sought at board level, such as the legal and accounting professions. But, you know, is it enough just to make room for women at the table? Well, the answer from my perspective is clearly no. We must foster a supportive and inclusive leadership approach, and we need to embrace and accommodate some of the unique challenges women face, such as the burden for childcare and the need for time off for parental leave. The disproportionate burden women have for caring needs to be considered within the system. Otherwise, we risk losing more women who opt out because the environmental factors have not been addressed, particularly in these COVID-19 challenging times. The joint report published by our own New Zealand Institute of Directors and law firm Minter Ellison Rudd Watts titled Should I Stay or Should I Go, explored the barriers associated with directors taking a leave of absence. Although, of course, a leave of absence affects both males and females and can occur for a variety of reasons, they explored the issue of women considering taking parental leave to start or build their family. They highlighted that women pursuing governance roles have limited options to take parental leave. And even if they were to take a leave of absence, there, of course, is no guarantee that their seat at the table would be available to them on completion of their leave. And on top of that, they may also be liable during their absence. New Zealand company law doesn't expressly deal with the director's leave of absence and related liability, which creates some uncertainty around the director's legal position. This certainly can lead directors to take the safest option and resign, rather than staying on as a director and risk being liable if something goes awry while they are absent. As the authors note, this is obviously a very poor outcome, with the loss of skilled directors further resulting in smaller, less diverse talent pools. Another area that I'm often asked about is gender quotas and targets. My thinking has evolved over time, and today I think we possibly need a combination of both. Targets have not yet delivered against their aspirational goals, and the fallout from COVID in particular will be felt for years to come. Progress is just too slow to achieve meaningful change, which is evidenced by the glacial movement in statistics year after year. Certainly, there are well-documented pros and cons for quotas versus targets, and I think it's fair to say that the jury is still out on the full effectiveness of quotas as a means of increasing gender balance on boards. It's a fraught issue, and there is much debate about whether quotas damage or promote women's interests. However, the alternative of leaving it up to an organisation's discretion to make this change voluntarily is at best misguided. Targets at the end of the day are voluntary. While many organisations have set targets and some have been successful, there are many, many more that have missed targets because at the end of the day, there are no consequences. In the Australian Workplace Gender Equality Agency Targets and Quotas Perspectives paper, they comment that the biggest benefit of quotas is that they create a critical mass of women in senior roles, which ultimately enriches the talent pipeline. And as we know, this is essential for a diverse network for candidate selection. They argue that decades of aspirational programs aimed at promoting gender equality, including diversity targets, have not achieved the necessary change. Ultimately, those against quotas say they are a blunt instrument and drastic, and it's true they are, but they are certainly effective at creating serious change quickly. Quotas essentially elevate gender equality to the top of a company's agenda, which in turn forces them to look beyond their traditional approaches to achieve their goals. And then we come to the next argument against quotas, and that is that they are discriminatory against men. But it's equally easy to argue that we are correcting existing and systemic discriminatory practice against women. In effect, quotas are making room for women, not removing men. Finally, no woman wants to be the token female on the board appointed without merit. Many would assert that male candidates will be overlooked as a result of quotas. And look, this could be so. But I would also argue if organisations are doing the hard work of building a diverse talent pipeline over time, then there will be a more gender diverse talent pool to select the best talent on merit, thereby mitigating the risk of tokenism. But like everything, there can be unintended consequences of the quota system. In 2006, the state gave Norway 5 years to achieve 40% women on listed company boards, and there were severe penalties for non-compliance. One of the fallouts was that at the time of introduction, 40% of Norwegian listed companies converted into private limited companies, with 2/3 of them admitting that the quota rules were behind their decision to delist from the stock exchange. That said, the latest 2020 Nordic Spencer Stewart Board Index shows that the share of women directors currently stands at 44%. A great achievement on one hand, but on the other, it has resulted in a prominent group of Norwegian women, nicknamed the Golden Skirts, taking up multiple board directorships, up to 185 in one instance. This cannot be a good outcome either, and does little to advance more women through the pipeline. So, like everything else, there are pros and cons, and both quotas and targets are not perfect mechanisms by any means. So I probably will leave it to you to decide whether you think the time is right for quotas in your country. But what else can we be doing? There is no shortage of research and resources available that can provide guidance to organisations seeking to achieve to do this. And there are recurring themes, whether it's from the World Economic Forum, the New Zealand Institute of Directors, Catalyst, McKinsey, Deloitte, or any of the many others. I've talked about some of these already, but my top picks include establish and disclose a diversity and inclusion policy with measurable targets and then report progress. There's nothing like accountability. Expand those traditional recruitment channels, cultivate diverse networks to broaden the pool of candidates. I think fundamentally build capacity for the future by co-opting women onto boards, establish sponsorship and mentorship programs, and develop governance programs for young aspiring directors. This includes actively boosting women in leadership roles, and in doing so, creating role models for others to follow. Diversity creates diversity. And create a culture of inclusion that encourages the retention of women in the workplace, including parental leave policies, return to work transition, and flexible work policies. We need to retain women more than ever within the workforce, especially in these COVID uncertain times. And finally, tackle unconscious bias and examine the way in which it might be holding the status quo in place or preventing inclusion. So, in conclusion, is there a silver bullet? No. As we can see, there is not one answer that will solve this problem, but a multifaceted systems approach with sustained and measurable actions will create the change we need to see. It needs to happen at both the macro and the micro levels. One thing is for sure, organisations must first recognise that diversity and inclusion is strategically important and accept the value add that diversity brings. And without saying any more, this must start at the very top. Thank you. Kia ora.
That's fantastic, Susan. Thank you very much for that presentation and some thought starters to kick off our panel conversation shortly. A few questions have come in before we move to the panel that I'd love to get your views on. What sort of programs and tactics that you're seeing either in New Zealand or elsewhere to grow the pipeline of women in leadership across various age groups? You talked a little bit about some of that mentoring. What sort of things we can do for those different age groups?
Well, I think mentoring is a really great place to start. Obviously, you know, teaming up younger people with older experienced hands really goes a long way. Sponsorship programs as well is really critical, which work slightly differently to mentorship, but it really is actively sponsoring a younger person through up their career. I think also when we're within organisations, it's about really doing good talent management practices, identifying some key talent early, giving them experiences that will help broaden them, particularly across commercial areas of the business. Because again, we know that women are overrepresented in areas that aren't necessarily giving them that exposure. So I think the more that we can look at this from quite a systems point of view, will create some change.
Yeah, fantastic. What about incentivized quotas? Jim has asked a question about, would that be unethical, similar to green finance, but perhaps a diversity incentive? I think perhaps we're getting those questions from institutional investors, aren't we? So there's sort of a diversity incentive already there.
I think so. It's interesting. I've read some research on this myself. I haven't actually seen diversity incentives in practice. I think it, and it's an interesting approach. If we give more incentives, such as tax incentives, certainly from an organisational point of view, there will be a significant focus on ensuring we've got good gender representation on board, because it's good for the bottom line at the end of the day. Like everything, there's consequences, and I think it's about having a balance to everything.
Yeah. I think you made a very compelling case for why it's good for business. So hopefully we shouldn't need incentives to do the right thing that's good for business and good for shareholders and good for everybody, but perhaps it's an option. Also got a question here about not-for-profits. And I was asked a question about if we know the percentage of women working in not-for-profits. That's a statistic we don't have to hand here in New Zealand because it's not as publicly available information as our listed companies. But is there a tendency for women to be more represented in not-for-profit entities? Are they more inclusive? We often hear that that's a good place for women to start their governance careers, but sometimes we hear it's difficult for them to move to commercial roles because people say they then don't have commercial experience.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. I don't have those particular statistics, but we do know anecdotally that a lot of women do start their governance careers in not-for-profit organisations. And often it's because it aligns with a lot of the characteristics that we see that women bring, such as the sense of social justice or equality or empathy, all of those sorts of things. So they're naturally drawn to a lot of these organisations. But women actually develop some amazing skills on those boards. Not for profits, some can be small, others can be quite large organisations. And you do need to have a broad brush understanding of commerciality in order to be successful on those boards. And I think it's the great breeding ground and a great hunting ground for those boards looking for other diverse talent to join their commercial boards.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There's a range of other questions here coming in, Susan, but I know you're joining the panel for their conversation next. So I know Julia will direct some of those questions to you. It's my great pleasure now to hand over to the President of the IOD for New Zealand, Julia Hoare. Julia is going to introduce you to a phenomenal panel and who will be able to answer a few more of those questions after they've had a few more comments. Thanks.